Pakistan is a troubled country. Bits of it are much more troubled than others. It is also, however, a huge country. It has almost 200 million people in it now. Second biggest Muslim country in the world after Indonesia. Sixth biggest country, I think, altogether in the world. A country of that size can absorb a remarkable amount of damage, without collapsing. And what I argue very strongly in the book is that Pakistan is not a failed state or failing state. In certain respects, it's not even a fragile state, oddly enough. When I say this, I contrast Pakistan very deliberately with some failed states in which I have worked myself in the past as a journalist and researcher, like Afghanistan, Chechnya. Those are failed states. Pakistan is not at present. This was brought home to me very much during my last trip by a few days I spent in the district of Swat. Swat, some of you may remember, was an area that was actually effectively taken over by the Taliban in 2008 and early 2009 and used as a base for trying to take over neighbouring areas. I was there for the previous time, just after the army operation in 2009. I went back this time, and I must say I was very struck by the success of the army operation and also by the success of reconstruction. The success of reconstruction was particularly striking because in the interval last summer, Swat also suffered particularly badly from the floods which devastated Pakistan last August and September. Or rather, it didn't devastate Pakistan, the floods. This is another great example of the fact that you must read the Western media with care. Because the loss of livestock was very serious in Pakistan, yes. There was considerable damage to roads, although frankly in Pakistan you wouldn't always notice whether a road was damaged or not. They are, as you might say, congenitally damaged. The loss of life in a country that size was surprisingly small, only about 1,500 people. I mean, I say only, but given the scale of the floods, it could have been much greater. Now, why was that? Well, the interesting reason was that the system actually worked. The barrages, the anti-flood barrages put in place first by the British, then by the Pakistanis, mostly in the 50s and 60s, held. They were not overwhelmed. The floodplains, which were left to absorb the overflow of the rivers in the case of floods, have, of course, as many people have said, been occupied illegally by local people. But those local people aren't damn fools. When they see floods on the way, they know where they live, they leave, they get out. The waters were directed into the floodplains, they were held by the barrages, the cities were therefore not flooded, the cities were not destroyed. As for the villages, they were, of course, quite often washed away, but to be brutally frank, mud huts are easy to rebuild. This isn't like the destruction in the Pakistani countryside, of a sophisticated modern infrastructure. In addition, something that I dwell on very much in the book is the already existing and growing threat in future of water shortages as perhaps a greater threat to Pakistan in the long run than terrorism or extremism today. I stress in the long run. Well, I mean, the thing about the floods is that they, of course, actually replenished the water reserves of parts of the country. They replenished the Indus Delta, which has been drying up in recent decades. And partly in consequence, though also in consequence, of course, of the impact of China and India on international commodity prices, Pakistani agriculture today, despite the floods, is actually experiencing a boom, an export boom. And insofar as that is feeding into the various minor local industries and services which provide for agriculture, is helping to sustain the economy as a whole. I mean, the economy is doing badly, but it's not actually doing as badly as many people were predicting a couple of years ago, because agriculture is doing better. These are none of them, I think I'm right in saying, pictures that you would receive mostly from the Western media, writing about Pakistan. They're not pictures my mother-in-law received, which is why if I took her daughter and grandson there, she would form an alliance with the Taliban and hunt me down, you see. So anyway, a most unusual alliance that would be, but effective, I fear. Now, the other thing about Pakistan is it does remind me, in certain respects, of Russia, a country from which my father's ancestors were descended, and where I spent most of the 1990s as a journalist, and on aspects of which I've written several books. In that, I mean, Pakistan is much worse off than Russia in every way, but they do have this in common, that states that are, by Western standards at least, in varying degrees, incompetent, inefficient, corrupt, and so forth and so on, are still capable, when they really put their minds to it, of concentrating on and dealing with particular issues. And that is true above all in both cases, of course, and has always been true historically of Russia when it comes to the military. If it's a military issue, as long as, of course, they're not faced with overwhelming outside force, they can concentrate on it and solve it brutally, but they do. Now, this was brought home to me very much by this trip to Swat in March. The first thing striking, of course, is the improvement in the security situation. There have been no terrorist attacks in Swat now for more than 6 months. Striking in an area which, as I say, was previously one of the heartlands of militant support in Pakistan. This required a very large-scale army operation. And the Pakistanis have a point when they say that, you know, these operations take a large number of men. In the initial operation, they had to deploy 2 divisions. There's still a division and a bit up there in Swat. That's quite a lot for what is basically one long but narrow valley. The second thing is, of course, the brutality of the operation. Not very brutal by South Asian standards, but then that's not saying very much if you look at the history of Pakistani, Indian and Sri Lankan counterinsurgency operations. But certainly from my own interviews in Swat and from some direct testimony when I was there in 2009, I can endorse the picture drawn by Human Rights Watch in its report on Swat of extrajudicial executions by the army, which I was told are still going on at a rate of, well, some people said 1 or 2, some people said 5 or 6. Clearly the army isn't giving official figures, but they are going on. Now, I was told that most of the local population, not all, are prepared to accept these extrajudicial executions, partly encounter killings, as they're called in India and Pakistan, partly because the Taliban did make themselves quite widely hated in Swat by their brutality, but also because in a large majority of cases the army does at least get the right people. In other words, it's not hauling out completely innocent people in the middle of the night and shooting them in the back of the head.